معتز سامعني؟
تفضل
معتز؟
دكتور. تفضل دكتور.
على كان أرسل لينك للدكتور ناهد محمد الحسن.
الناهد محمد الحسن.
عندكم يكون عندكم اللينك بتاعها، أو ابعتها لي أنا وأنا ببعتها لها. ابعت لي اللينك.
اوكي.
طيب. اوكي خلاص نبدأ. المستمعين الأعزاء لسيمينار المركز العربي.
Ladies and gentlemen, my dear participants and viewers, today is a special occasion. It gives me a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Francis Deng. He's a veteran in the Sudanese diplomacy. He is also an international diplomat who has spent the last 2 decades working as an advisor for the Secretary General or a representative in 2 important tasks, the IDP's related program, as well as resisting genocide. At the same time, he is a Sudanese diplomat, as we said, a former minister, a former ambassador, and he descends from the north of Sudan, but nowadays he is an ambassador in South Sudan. Dr. Francis Deng, he is an old friend, and I remember Francis, if I'm not mistaken, we first met in Atlanta in 1992 in January. At the time, during the first meeting, Professor Francis narrated a story when he had a dinner with an American diplomat, and the American diplomat asked him to explain the problem of Sudan. Francis explained the matter, and then the American asked him, "Are you from South Sudan or North Sudan?" Francis said, "Have a guess." So the American gentleman said, "I think you are a Muslim from South Sudan." So Francis replied, he said, "I'm not a Muslim, I am not from South Sudan." He descends from Abyei, from the northern parts of Sudan, and this area represented a bridge by virtue of the Dinginyok tribe's leader, who's his father. His father has led the tribe at the beginning of the British colonization up until the independence with the Misriya. He had good relations, and the leader of the Misriya, Babu Nimr, and it was decided that Abyei belongs to the northern parts of Sudan. The British proposed that Abyei can be indeed kind of annexed to the southern parts of Sudan because of the Ding tribe and the affiliations and so on and so forth. But his father refused, and he was adamant on keeping this province in or belonging to the northern parts of Sudan or North Sudan. Francis will elaborate on this later. But before that, I'd like to narrate another story. At the same meeting, I and Bon Manuel from the Dinga tribe, from the southern parts of Sudan, from Kawil, this gentleman was at the meeting as well, and we launched the first peaceful initiative during the war between the North and the South. And indeed, we formulated it and we sent the first draft to the government of Sudan, and it was agreed upon by the government. And Dr. Francis went to see Dr. Jongai, and unfortunately, this proposal didn't see the light. And in 1995, I, Francis, and Bona, Muhammad Ahmed Abdullah, the Minister of Farming or Agriculture and the head of the president of Al Khartoum University, and Abdul Muhammad from Ethiopia, and the ambassador at Tibligat. Indeed, we had a committee that incorporated 7 members, and we used to follow the peace process and try to provide support to the peace process. And it seems that I and Dr. Francis were not candidates of the Nobel Peace process, unfortunately, and this is a mistake on their part. Dr. Francis today will be talking about the issue of identity, and this is a continuation to my seminar that took place lately in this center, or took place last year rather. I have talked about identity politics. I've talked about the history of the Sudanese identity in that seminar, and I quoted Mr. Francis at the time. Dr. Francis is a prolific writer as far as the identity and as far as identity and diversity are concerned, and he dealt with this issue in Sudan. As I said, the identity theme was addressed at our meeting. I revised Cry of the Owls novel for Mr. Francis. I reviewed the book, and he indeed alluded to the Sudanese identity allegorically and in the novel. In the novel, there are 2 brothers, one or 2 from a Dikawi mother, and one from a Dinka father, and another from an Arab father. And the pure Dinka was raised in an Arab area, and he became an Islamist. However, his half-brother became a fighter who belonged to the movements in the South. And in the novel, Mr. Francis dealt with the constructive identity, as we all agree, but there are certain contentions as far as the identity politics is concerned. We now would move to the Sudanese northern international diplomat Francis Deng to start his intervention. He'll be talking in English. Francis, the floor is yours. Yes, we have agreed to talk in English. Now let me switch to English.
It's an honor to give this talk. And it's a great pleasure, actually, to see my old friend. I mean, old in terms of time, not in terms of age. To be the one moderating this meeting. And Abdul Wahab has made it so much easier for me because he has given you a background, which is, I think, critical to understanding the issues that I'm going to be talking about. What I'll be talking about is also a rather sensitive and complex, controversial issue, this issue of identity. And what I'd like to start with is that, in a sense, my view on these issues is informed by the fact that I come from the Sudan, a country that has faced crises of identity that eventually led to even partitioning of the country. But it also comes from my own experiences with the United Nations, both as representative of the Secretary General on internally displaced people and prevention of genocide. And these are mandates that took me all around the world. And I witnessed firsthand the extent to which countries have been sharply divided by issues of identity. And at the same time, although I'm building on my own experiences, I think the issues we're talking about are quite generic, and almost every country in the world, I think, faces them. Let me begin by saying that identity is a very important concept. It's one to which all of us, as individuals and groups, feel very strongly about. It starts with who you are, where you come from, your community, your family, ultimately your country. But it is also a concept that has a lot to do with how you relate to others. In other words, we have this idea of identity being what you are and what you feel you are, as opposed to what people think you are. And this is an issue that we can talk about later in terms of subjectivity and objectivity of identity. But the starting point is what you are and how you feel about what you are in terms of your cultural background, values that are associated with your cultural background. And a central issue of identity is a sense of pride, sense of dignity. And every community sees itself as the model of what ought to be, not only in terms of personal attributes, but also in terms of values. What is critical here is when you then get into a context of diversity when you begin to meet others of different identities, different cultures, different values. So you then start with an identity which has its own dignity, and then you get into a situation of diversity with others. And these others also come with the same self-perception of pride, of dignity, seeing you create the context that is the model, that is the ideal almost. Every community has that sense of itself when seen in isolation. Now, when you get into a situation of diversity, which is the case in most countries, there's no country that is absolutely monolithic. And even a country like Somalia ultimately is seen in terms of clans and was torn apart by clan differences. So we can say almost every country has an element of diversity in it. Now, when you speak of diversity, then you raise the question of equality or inequality. Is the context of diversity dominated by one identity? Can it accommodate diversities of identities? Can unity be reconciled with equality, with a sense of differences? In other words, should a country run itself on the basis of diversity despite wanting to be in unity? Can unity and diversity reconcile? And if the ideal is equality, can differences and equality also be reconciled? And if we want to create a framework that is more unifying, because identity can be exclusive or inclusive, if we decide that we want a national identity that is unifying, should it be based on the identity of one group, or is it possible to create a new identity in a country? These are critical questions. I remember giving a lecture in a meeting which was attended by a number of heads of states of Africa. And I was talking about constructive management of diversity. And after my speech, one of the presidents of Africa was called upon to comment. And he said the basic principle of constructive management of diversity is a good one. But our goal should be integration, not management of diversity. In other words, he believes that the vision of a country should not be that we accommodate our differences. The ideal should be that we create an integrated identity. Well, if you do that, on the basis of which identity are you going to integrate the nation? These are some of the critical questions. Now, as I said before, my experiences are based on, my views are based on my experiences around the world. And I have been to a number of countries where I would first meet with the heads of state, maybe senior ministers, then I would go to see those who are displaced. And after discussing with them, I would ask the question, what message do you want me to take to your leaders? And almost in all the countries I went to, virtually all around the world, Latin America, Central Europe, Africa, and what have you, the message was the same. One leader of the community in Latin America said, those people are not our leaders. We are not part of that government. To those people, we are not citizens. We are criminals. And our only crime is that we are poor. In a Central Asian country, the response was, that is not our government. We don't have anybody in that government. In an African country, one person said to me, actually there was a prime minister talking to a senior UN official. And this UN official reported to me how this prime minister said to him, the food you give to those internally displaced people, the food you give to those people is killing my soldiers. Those people were his citizens, but he felt that his people were the soldiers and not those people who were displaced. I give these examples to say that our United Nations is an organization of mostly divided nations, nations that are torn apart by identity differences. I remember very well leaving countries after having met with leaders and talked to displaced people, and I would leave wondering, when will these people get together? How will they get together to form a nation that is genuinely united, that calls itself a united nation? It's a tough one. Now, my experiences also led me to experiencing diverse ways of dealing with the situation. Different models. Now, if we take, for instance, countries like Rwanda and Burundi, Rwanda, after having gone through genocide, has come out with a model which sees itself as one country where there is no Tutsi and no Hutu and no Twa. We're all Rwandese. And so it has become more or less enshrined that you should not talk ethnicity. You should not talk about being a Hutu or a Tutsi or a Twa. You are Rwandese. And then you go to Burundi with exactly the same composition of ethnic groups. They have Tutsis, Hutus, and Twas. Burundi, unlike Rwanda, has decided to be realistic about the fact that there are these ethnic groups and that the challenge is how to manage their differences. Now you go to Sudan. Sudan experimented with both, integrating the country on the basis of an Arab Islamic identity, which failed because you have not only the South, but also many elements of the North who do not identify themselves as Arabs. So the next step in the Sudan was to experiment with accommodating diversity in a framework of unity and diversity. The Addis Ababa Agreement was more or less along the same lines. It gave South Sudan autonomy within the framework of unity and really seemed to succeed. For 10 years, Southerners who had been separatists became unionists, very much so. And until Nimeri undid the agreement that actually brought the country into a genuine consensual unity. That led to the next conflict, which lasted, as you know, for over 20 years. And we ended with an agreement, the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, which was based on the principle of one country, two systems. And one country, two systems was an attempt to balance between the separatist tendency in the South and the unionist position of the North, and to balance also reconcile two different perceptions of the country. as an Arab Islamic country and the Southern African secular country. That seemed to work during the interim period. And those of us who were involved in this, and I co-chair a committee of the Center for Strategic International Studies in Washington that proposed this arrangement. My personal objective was to save the unity of the country by recognizing this dualism of identity. That obviously failed, and that led to partitioning the country. What I'm trying to say here, the challenge is not being different. The challenge is how we deal with the differences. The challenge is how we deal with an identity that accommodates people with a sense of belonging to the city, to the country as citizens, and a framework that makes everybody feel proud to be a citizen of that country on equal footing. I have to say, my friend Abdulwahab gave a seminar, I think in this same setting, where the issue came up and our long, nice, friendly differences came up. And I was set up almost, as I told him later, like a straw man. That I said, Francis was arguing that if we wake up one day and we say we are Africans, not Arabs, the problems will be solved. In a sense, I'm saying two things. In the Sudan, people identify themselves as Arabs who are actually a mix. And almost every Sudanese will say, there is no pure anything in the Sudan. You are not purely Arab, you're not purely African. And for me, this is an enrichment. We are enriched by our identity as being fed by our Arab Islamic identity, our African identity. And the challenge was how to merge a vision of a Sudan that brings all this together and sees it as a self-enrichment for the country, as a source of enrichment. So my one argument was that people were distorting their self-perceptions when they just say they are this or that. They're a mix. But my second argument was that this perception, which does not reflect reality and which represents only a portion of the country, is then presented as the framework for the whole country, despite diversities. So in other words, you begin to impose an identity which in itself is not as monolithic or simple as people present it, but then impose it on a country of diversity. So what I was arguing is, number one, let us identify ourselves for what we are. We are a mix. Number two, let us create a framework that then accommodates all of us on equal footing. But identity, diversity, and with dignity as the element of each of the identities did not seem to create a framework that everybody belonged. And even one country, two systems failed. And therefore, we got into where we got separation of the country. Now, I should say, though, that these different models that I have presented, the vision of Rwanda, which is an idealistic vision that we should not see ourselves in divisive terms, that see ourselves as a nation, as one people, give ourselves the label of the nation. We are Rwandese. That's a vision that is aspirational. That's a vision of what ought to be. Now, the vision of Burundi is a pragmatic one that says, let's be realistic. We do have Tutsis, we have Hutus, we have Tuas. How do we manage to accommodate all of this? So they get into power sharing in all the institutions of government, executive, legislative, even the army became balanced, integrated. The vision of Sudan, which experimented with all three, integration, accommodation of differences, and ultimately partitioning, is itself indicative of the fact that perhaps what we need, or what we needed in the Sudan, was let us, for now, manage our differences by recognizing that we have differences that should be accommodated. But let us then work towards an integrated model where we interact over a period, we give and take, we evolve the commonality that the SPLM, the movement based in South Sudan, basically, but became accommodating of others, called New Sudan. The vision of New Sudan began to inspire, not only in the South, but particularly in the North. Southern Sudanese did not really believe in a unified New Sudan. John Garang led it and made them believe that this was the best way of, even if they wanted to separate, you don't want to antagonize people because you are saying, I want to be a separatist. You postulate a vision of justice, of fairness, of belonging. That is how you will get support. Support even within North Sudan, and support from Africa, who do not want countries to be divided and all that. So in a sense, I think Sudan stood a good chance of saying, let us accommodate our differences as an interim arrangement, but let us create a framework of interacting and maybe evolving into one unified nation. That didn't work. But my position was that the vision of New Sudan is not just for the old Sudan. It's a vision that applies to literally every country in the world. We all need a new country that accommodates people because diversities are everywhere. And the vision is to come together in a genuine, if not integrated, at least equitable country that accommodates everybody. After partition, my position is we are still bound by conflict because each of the two independent countries supports rebels in each other's country, so that you have Sudan still supporting militias in South Sudan supporting rebel groups in North Sudan. The challenge then is, can we cooperate to solve our problems, helping one another to solve internal problems so that we can create a situation where instead of continuing to be bound by conflict, let us be bonded by solutions. Frankly, I think this is where we are now in terms of relations between Sudan and South Sudan. And the four principles that I started with, which have to be borne in mind, are identity associated with dignity, associated with a sense of recognizing how you relate to people in a diverse situation, and how you achieve unity through equality. Those three principles, identity, dignity, diversity, equality, are central in order to make identities come together. So what is problematic is not being different, but how you manage the differences. And in most cases, we mismanage the differences. You have a people who see themselves as the, what you might call first-class citizens who enjoy all the rights of citizenship. You have people who are discriminated, marginalized, excluded, who become second, third-class citizens. I had an African leader say, we were in Sudan, and we saw what was happening. The first-class citizens were the Arabs of Central Sudan. Second-class citizens were Western Sudanese who are Muslims but not Arabs. Third-class citizens were we from Eritrea and Ethiopia. And South Sudanese came as fourth-class citizens. And he said, how can there be unity with people divided into these classes? And I said, if you consider Muslims from West Africa coming to Sudan, they would probably be the fourth-class citizens, which will make Southerners become the fifth-class citizens. And so that was not a tenable arrangement. But the vision of a new Sudan, of full equality, of belonging to the nation, is a vision I still believe is a challenge, not only to Sudan, but even to South Sudan, to all countries, to create a framework of genuine belonging. I know that my time is limited and running out, so let me get to concluding argument. Now, we may say that elections are the solution, that in a country, as long as people elect their leaders, there should be no problems of identity differences. But the reality is that our people in diverse countries vote their identities. You have seen South Sudan torn apart by differences. It is not because people are different in terms of ethnic groupings that conflicts occur. It is because these differences are usually associated with inequalities, with injustices, with groups feeling that this is being dominated or captured by one or two groups, as now is being said to be the case of South Sudan, and which was the case in the Sudan. And then we say that these differences are exploited by politicians. It's true. Political entrepreneurs exploit differences for their own political ends. And it doesn't mean that identities don't exist. It doesn't mean that grievances that politicians exploit exist. You cannot exploit something that does not exist. So apart from the exploitation by political entrepreneurs, we ask, what really are they exploiting? They're exploiting a sense of grievances, a sense of injustice, a sense of mistreatment by dominant groups. So the question then arises, can we create a situation? Can we reconcile diversities with the principle of full equality and a full belonging to the nation? But one big question, if we cannot do that, there will always be some degrees of differences and some degrees of moving forward towards the ideal model that is never fully achieved. There are countries like the United States where, despite the differences, they feel they're Americans, but they do recognize their differences. Europe has evolved from sharp differences to now creating a framework that they call the European Union. And so some differences will always exist. But when the differences are very sharp and inequalities are so gross that they are intolerable, then we have to ask the question, is unity an end in itself? Or can there be situations where maybe friendly divorce is permissible? And then, even with friendly divorce, maybe you then relax and begin to come back together. South Sudan is a very good example of how people were very sensitive to the idea of Arabism or Arabic as a language or even associated religion, Islam. But once you give South Sudanese the autonomous identity in the government of Nimeri, South Sudanese became more unionist than even some northern Sudanese. Then now with independence of South Sudan, you hear this religious prayers in mosques, كأنك في دولة إسلامية, as though you are in a Muslim country. And you, as I said before, I go to give talks in universities and talking English. People tell me, يا أخي اتكلم عربي, please talk Arabic, because many don't know Arabic. I don't know English. So once you give people their freedom, they are then able to see the positives in the identities that they were resenting before and begin to enrich themselves. Sudan, whether South Sudan or North Sudan, is enriched by the diverse cultures and languages and religions that have come together. So once you give people that freedom, now they're able to see the positives in each other. And I hope we can then evolve back to some kind of a framework, maybe not the old Sudan of unity, but a new Sudan, South Sudan affiliation or association, a coming together where we enjoy the differences as a source of enrichment. Finally, let me just end by saying that when you talk about elections as critical to democracy, you also have to recognize that elections, which means that winner take all, cannot reconcile some of our fundamental values in our culture. Our African cultures are known to be more consensus-oriented rather than winner take all. They are also known to be a culture where you talk and talk until you come to an agreement. It's a culture where we have to now reconcile the principles that have become universally accepted, called electoral democracy, with the principle of consensus and accommodation of differences. So perhaps there's no way out of genuine, free, and fair elections. But then it is important for the winners to be within a cultural framework of consensus building. which means that you become magnanimous enough to create governments of unity, even if you are the winner in elections, rather than say, I rule until you win again and kick me out of power. So I think what we need to do is understand our cultures, understand the fundamentals of our cultural values, and see, having understood our cultures, see our differences. Are they complementary, or do we need a new synthesis that we can come out with a framework of a national identity and associated cultural values that then guide us in our creating our constitutions, our governance system, as models that are enriched by diversities of cultures. Yes, let's take from the West, let's take what concepts have been accepted universally of democracy, human rights, but let us see how we contextualize these principles by looking at our value system. Finally, this really means that we have to know who we are, what values we have. South Sudanese used to identify themselves negatively. We are non-Arab, we are non-Muslims. What are you? And even now, we may say we are Southerners. What is that? We are Dinkas, we are Nuer, we are Zandi, we are Shuluk. What is that? So understand what that means in terms of content of values. Then let's get together and compare notes and see, do we complement one another? Can we create a synergy and then use this to guide our constitutionalism and our system of governance? Very last word, I am guided by two principles that I try to apply on a personal level, but also collectively. Pessimism leads to a dead end and should be avoided. But one cannot be optimistically blind in a sense that you are just, it's what you call blind optimism. You have to be optimistic based on certain concrete, credible basis. So avoid pessimism, be optimistic, but have strategic optimism that builds on foundations. I would like to end here by thanking you again for giving me this opportunity. And I hope I've given you some meat for thought. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francis. I forgot also to add that Dr. Francis has also, I think, contributed a great idea to international diplomacy, which is the responsibility to protect. A lot of people now look at the responsibility to protect as the outcome of the report by the Special Commission, which was supported by Canada and headed by the former Australian Foreign Minister. But in fact, in the report itself, there is a reference to a book edited by Dr. Francis called Sovereignty as Responsibility, which raised this issue of the limitations of sovereignty when issues like genocide and other issues take place, and the need for international responsibility for this. I think we will now open the floor for comments and questions. If anyone from the panels, I might start with Dr. Hamid, whom I can see from here, if he wants to make any comment. Dr. Hamid is the Dean of the School of الإدارة العامة والاقتصادية التنمية.
Okay, I will, given that Dr. Francis Deng commented on this issue of identity, and he's spoken in English, so he's entitled that my response also will be on the same line, which I wish that I could speak it in Arabic. Let's say that is, when we talk about the identity, of course, itself is either you are looking for inward looking or outward looking. If you're looking for the inward looking, it's always you are going back, just the issue of North and South Sudan, who we are. Then when the South is separated, the inward looking taken South Sudan later on into another search for some identities within the Southern Sudan. The same thing is either you're looking outward looking for the identity. That means we are recognizing the identity. And recognition of the identity, I will take it to the direction of, and of course, Dr. Francis is on the issues of identity, he lived on it and he intellectually contributed on it. And also I recognize Dr. Abdul Wahab arguments about the history of chronology of the identity in Sudan. If we are looking and outward looking, why are we going to look on the political economy of the identity? The political economy of identity, this will going to give us an opportunity that by recognizing the identity, these differences, sense of belonging to everyone that to be there, this will lead us to the idea of social justice, and that social justice, it should be translated into the political economy of identity. In other words, created opportunities, economic opportunities for those. And economic opportunity, access to the resources. This is the only way you are going to mitigate the level of grievances. If we don't pay attention to the economic side and expanding the social network, that everybody feeling that they have a stake in this country, then I think we're going to be talking about that issue without making real progress. And at the end of the day, that's what has happened in Sudan as a country. They were talking about it as an identity, as an issue, but the recognition of it is supposed to be translated into the economic opportunity, and that has never been realized. The other part of the identity is an evolutionary process in Sudan. And if we look on the Sudan, it's a land of black, Ard Sudan, or Blad Sudan, the land of the blacks. So this is very stretched and very wider land that even it should encompassing more of a diversity. And the concept is diffused to a specific land of Sudan. And if you look on this land, we have at least 6 consecutive kingdoms. Those 6 consecutive kingdoms, it just have some sort of enrichment, because if we look for the kingdom of Kush and Karma's civilization, which Abdul Wahab was alerted to it in his earlier arguments, then we come to the medieval Christian Nubian kingdoms. So that's one step better, one steps adding, as some sort of creating a soul to the issue of diversity. And later on, that also transforming itself. We have seen these Islamic kingdoms in Sinar and in Darfur, or call it the Fonj. This is stated also consists of some sort of a confederation of sultanate. If you look at the kingdom of Fonj, also you look for Darfur, you see the Kera Sultanate of Darfur, but they appear to be century later. So these are the places that are very diverse, and also they are economic center by itself. What has happened is after the Turkish, we call it the Turkish Egyptian period, Turkish, from 1821 to 1899, they have coerced these centers and forced them to be in a center that called it Khartoum. And the crisis of identity started becoming very important issue, not only in the southern Sudan. It was an issue in Darfur. It was an issue in even in some areas of the North Sudan. It became an issue. The Kush movement. We have seen the Darfur rebel movement. We see that is in the area of Funj. We have seen the Nuba Mountains and the Blue Niles rebel movement. This movement basically saying that no to the vision of Khartoum, because it can become a coercive center that's making everybody looking at where was sense of our belonging there. And it is true that is the politicians, they exploited that opportunity, or the political entrepreneur, as stated by Dr. Francis. It is true they are exploiting that opportunity, and the identity becomes some sort of a populist movement. And that's basically transcend the condition of or transcend the elitist discussion about the identity, because the people that in Khartoum, whether it's from Darfur, whether it's from the far north, whether from the southern Sudan, they are enjoying the fruit at the expense of the vast land of Sudan, that is particularly the South Sudan. And to me, because I visited South Sudan at least 5 times, 6 times since it's independent, since the country was broken and separated. Before that, I have never thought about visiting South Sudan for some other reason. But after I visited the Southern Sudan, I met with our colleagues there in Southern Sudan. You see the sense of the pride, you see sense of belonging, you see the sense that they achieve some sort of a political aspiration, and also make the Northerns more humble and more recognizing that is the injustice that they have perpetuated in the Southern Sudan and in the rest of the country. And this is basically, I'm talking about Khartoum, because you go far north, you see that also, you see underdevelopment, you see marginalized people. So the issue is become the issue of Khartoum, who try to impose one vision of an identity that is rejected by all parts of Sudan. And so for now, we must look for the
if you can conclude, Hamid.
Okay, so looking forward, I think there will be a better opportunity. We look for how we are going to not to managing diversity, rather than looking for the economic opportunity to address the issue of diversity. Thank you so much.
Just to reiterate to our audience across various platforms, كل متابعينا عبر وسائل التواصل.
Our followers, please, if you want people who joined us via Zoom, you can raise your hands.
Or send a message through the notes messaging. And those also, our staff are monitoring all the platforms for comments, which will be relayed to. Before I move to someone else, I would like also to add comments, I think, on both what Hamid said and what Francis has quoted. I think what Francis is probably looking at is what should be leadership. Usually when you have a leader, especially from the majority or the dominant group, usually if they can reach out to the diverse minorities in the country, or those who are disadvantaged, even sometimes in symbolic terms, it could be advantageous. We have examples through diverse countries where you find that the leader, for example, though he belongs to an ethnicity, for example, in India, Jawaharlal Nehru was an example of a visionary leader who kept the country together. And we can see later leaders did not actually follow that model. In India, we don't want to go into detail, it's all known for all of us. Similarly, but on the other hand, I think, and this is an issue which Francis, I differ a little bit on, I think there is an issue when there is hostility also in the minority to the majority identity. For example, in the South, there has been a kind of hostility to Arabism and to sometimes Islam. And although many citizens are also Muslim, but I remember when in the debate which I mentioned, I wrote commenting on Francis and said, in the United States, for example, we have two visions of Black identity. One vision is that of Louis Farrakhan and the Nation of Islam, who treat Islam as a kind of also another inner identity, separating them from the rest of the American people. While, for example, there are the mainstream Black community who want to integrate. And I gave an example of Louis Farrakhan, for example, and the former foreign minister, chief of staff in the United States, who was a Jamaican origin and Christian in religion. And he integrated into the country. And I said to Francis, although and I'm a Muslim, I think the model of the person who integrates, who at least shows respect to the dominant culture and try to accommodate it, would be for me better than the separatist approach of the Nation of Islam. So we see America, yes, as nowadays is very divisive, and the same issue of leadership appears. For example, under Trump, we find that the racism and white supremacy has come up. But now under Biden, for example, there is a different language of accommodation. So usually we have to look at the two sides of this equation. There is a need for leadership. There is a need for concessions of the minority. But there's also a need for some respect, at least, for what we could do together. I remember, I think Francis probably was with us in that meeting in Addis, where I had an exchange with our friend Bona, and he was showing hostility to the Arab language, the Arabic language. And I said to him, Bona, if you want to be a president of Sudan, and 70% of the people, their language is Arabic, you have to be prepared to go when you go for campaign to speak in Arabic. Otherwise, you wouldn't be elected. You can't send your message through. And he said to me, I don't care, I don't want you, I don't want your language. I'm satisfied with my Dinka identity, Dinka people, I don't need you. So I said to him, well, it's not in this case, you shouldn't complain that you are being marginalized and not getting into leadership position. So anyway, I'll stop here. Do we have any questions from the audience?
Can I comment or wait? Can I comment?
Okay, you can go and comment. Yes.
I just want to comment very briefly on the two comments. Number one, I think it's very, very important to recognize that we're not talking about just identity as a subjective sentiment. We're talking about the implications of identity. And in most cases, identity determines the distribution of not only power, but also resources. So when we speak about the economics of identity, I think that is the key. It's a key that we see, if you see yourself, if you call yourself whatever you want to call yourself as an Arab, for instance, in your own world, isolated from anybody else, there's no problem. That's your own business. But when your self-perception begins to dictate who gets what from the system in terms of power, resources, and all that, that then becomes the economics of identity. And that's the problem. It's the implications of identity. And here comes the question of leadership also. It's quite remarkable how John Garang really changed Sudanese perceptions on these issues. As I said earlier, most South Sudanese do not really want to believe in a vision of a new Sudan that would be unified. And they took John Garang as just a ploy to win people and to minimize opposition to separation. But he inspired Sudanese. All those people who are talked about the kingdoms and different groups within the Sudan who used to just be subsumed under one label, one model, began to wake up and say, now, wait a minute. We are not what we are being said to be. You know, we are more than that. We are more, we have a history, we have a culture, we have an identity. So I think the leadership of John Garang really made the country, it was incremental. It started with William Deng talking about the marginalized groups, and Garang pushed it further. And I honestly think that South Sudanese shortchanged themselves through independence because they could have continued to be part of the larger country that called itself the largest country in Africa with a beautiful map instead of now looking torn into north and south. So yes, leadership is critically important and identity is very important. One point, I'm glad you mentioned this question of sovereignty and sovereignty as a responsibility. Because we tend to want to isolate ourselves, and whatever happens internally, and the world is watching, and the world is critical, we say it's none of your business. This is our internal affairs. Sovereignty is asserted negatively as a barricade. And frankly, because I was negotiating with governments on very sensitive issues, I decided to use the concept of sovereignty as responsibility by going to a country, talking to a leader, president or minister. I'm here aware that this issue is primarily internal. It falls under your sovereignty. But I don't see sovereignty negatively as a barricade. I see it as a concept of state responsibility for its people. And if you need help, then call on the world to assist you. But if you fail and your people are suffering and dying in large numbers, the world is not going to watch and do nothing. They will get involved. So the best way to protect your sovereignty is to discharge the responsibilities of sovereignty. This idea has now been developed into the responsibility to protect, which is based on the concept of sovereignty as responsibility, but now seen as putting responsibility on the international community to intervene, which is why it is more sensitive and more controversial than the concept of sovereignty as responsibility. I'm glad you mentioned that, and I just wanted to add that piece. Thank you.
اوكي في اي اسئله؟ دكتور اشرف وعايز تعلق؟
Dr. Ashraf, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. First, I need to thank Dr. Abdullah Al-Afandi because it was his presentation which dragged Dr. Francis Deng to this lecture. I thank Francis also for the presentation. I agree with all the points he mentioned, that differences becomes a problem when they are converted into inequality. And the issue of identity as an issue that's associated mainly with social justice, not just economic justice, is also a good point. I just need to add something about the notion of differences in the context of Sudan. Differences are not taken for granted. That's my understanding. Those differences actually are partly, mainly, in my view, colonially constructed. We need to take the question of, the roots of those differences are not entirely post-colonial. Yeah, I entirely agree. Post-colonial leaders exploited those differences in the service of their politics, as you rightly mentioned, but the roots are colonial. The state, the structure of the state itself is colonially constructed. The clans, or we call them the tribes in Sudan, particularly within the British colonial system, were created, were constructed. Colonial difference, tribal differences, as we see them, are colonially constructed. So now the issue is that I like the project of the New Sudan because it addresses straight away the colonial roots of the state of Sudan. And I think that's something need to be taken into consideration. And a final point, because this will lead us also to diversity. We need also to problematize the concept of diversity. if we can talk about tribes in the context of the colonialism, the British colonial system, the colonial system produced a particular version of diversity. And that version of diversity was exploited by post-colonial politicians. Every or almost every political system, or political party has its own understanding and version of diversity, which serves its interests. Now the question is, what form of diversity, what kind of conception of diversity are we talking about? Because we have different versions and forms of diversity. This question itself has to be subjected to serious cultural political interrogation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Dr. Sultan Barakat.
صباح الخير جميعا. Good morning everyone. Can you hear me?
Yeah, okay.
First, I'd like to thank Dr. Francis. I think his talk has given us great insights. And if he allows me, I will just act as the devil advocate for a minute, in particular when it comes to conflict. On two bases. One is identity as a concept does and can evolve. And it's one of those very difficult to identify and stick with over time. And you could start in one end and end up somewhere else within a generation or two, depending on various aspects. And this has been part of the challenge, I think, facing those nations that see themselves as diverse and would like to give the ideally required respect and attention to diverse identity. And the second, which is maybe something we've seen in the Arab world and maybe parts of Africa and Southeast Asia and so on, is to manage diversity, you require quite a good level of infrastructure in terms of communication, connectivity, trade, etc., etc. That's not really there, and it places a huge amount of expense on the states. And it comes in direct conflict with the global reality we're all living in and the global poverty that is around us and so on. So it begs the question whether we should draw a limit. Where do you stop subdividing identity and opening the space for people to identify themselves with each other? Because in our type of culture, move on from regional all the way down to tribal, religious, languages, locations, families, subfamilies, etc., etc. And it has really complicated things when it comes to projects of state building. And finally, and I think this is maybe something that came to us from the West, that the literature and the opinions, the idealistic view of diversity has been exported to us, but in fact, even in their own countries, is not applied. And it's not respected to the degree it is expected from the others. And that has created a good degree of cynicism amongst some people who started to look at identity with suspicion, at diversity even as a concept with suspicion that it can only lead to fragmentation and weakening of the national state, if that's the right expression. Thank you very much.
Dr. Naid.
Thank you very much, Dr. Abdel Wahab. First, I need to thank Dr. Francis Deng for not only for this eloquent lecture, but also for his hard-working contribution towards peace and managing the identity dilemma in Sudan and South Sudan. Because me, as a generation born into dilemma of identity in Sudan and wars, I think his books like Dinka in Sudan, like a man called Deng Magok, Babu Nimir, and all these books, we have been studying and reading and getting to know the Dinka in Sudan, for example, and the different other and it helps much towards understanding, respecting diversity, celebrating it, because usually we look into diversity as a problem, not as a resourceful substance in among our nation that we can value and we can make use of it. And we are very sorry for the limited imagination of the founding father of Sudan after independence. Not only because they created problems through trying to think of a Sudan or trying to assimilate other identities into just one identity, the Arab Muslim identity, but because they created not only the ethnic groups clashes and wars, but also for the within the own claimed identity as Arab and Muslims. For example, me, if I used to identify myself as Nubian, as Black Arab Muslim, I can find myself into the liberal guilt of feeling ashamed about the failures, the oppression, the racism, and the marginalization of other ethnic groups and so on. And this ended in shaking up our own identity, our self-esteem about ourselves. And I think that was an expected result of such management of diversity. The good thing now, we need to revisit the issue of identity with more decency, because the war and the conflict will erode those wise discussions. As Dr. Francis Deng said, now we can sit, we can revisit our identity and try to answer the question, who are we? Okay, in the north or in the south or in the central, and what values in common do we have, and try to celebrate this hybrid. I think no one no longer think of there is any pure race or ethnic group in the world. People are hybrid, and we need to celebrate this and to visit our identity again. Thank you very much for this lecture.
Thank you. Thank you.
Dr. Francis, I will add another question which came to us from Anwar Dafa'allah through the media. هل ترى إمكانية لإعادة توحيد السودان شمال الجنوب وفق
Do you think that Sudan can be reunited, the south and the north?
Respond to this before we receive other questions.
السؤال الأخير.
Do you see prospects for uniting North and South according to the principle of the 2018 Revolution حرية سلام وعدالة؟
جدا. التعليق عليه؟
عليه وعلى السؤالين السابقين. على التعليقين السابقين.
If I may say, first of all, I really appreciate the points made, all very valid, and I feel very enriching to our conversation. أول حاجة, identity evolves. That's a fact. And the evolution of identities continues. The colonial influence, by the way, was paradoxical, because if it were not for colonialism, we may not have the countries we now call our countries. They were created by colonialism. In that sense, they did something which was intended for their own purposes, their own interests, in terms of reaching out to the outside world for economic opportunities and all that and that. But incidentally, they created countries that have broadened our sense of identity. Once they have done that, how we manage these new countries that they created is our responsibility. And that's where I think we always have to balance between recognizing the wrongs done by the colonial involvement in our part of the world, but also assuming responsibility for managing constructively what we have inherited from them. And I think if we create a broad framework within which evolutions can take place constructively, let me tell you a story I mentioned to somebody earlier. I went, when I was in University of Khartoum, years back in the 50s, 50s and early 60s, I went to a minister, Deng, and he was out of the office. And his office boy, Murasiliani, said to me in a very broken English, "Minister, no, minister, go." I then said to him in Arabic, "Why don't you speak the language you know? And if you are not understood, then try other languages." "Oh, I'm so sorry. I thought you were a Southerner." In those days, Southerners were not supposed to speak Arabic. But now, in South Sudan, it's commonplace. They talk classical Arabic. They talk Shi'r al-Arabi. The Malik, being a Muslim, was seen as being an Arab. Now, you have Southerners, recently for Ramadan, you couldn't believe that you were in South Sudan. يعني حاجة فاخرة جدا, something to be proud of. Yes, evolution is taking place, but create a framework where evolutions can take place in a positive way. And I like very much the points that have been made by Nahid, and I appreciate very much what she said. And I'm part of the evolution now is we are becoming aware of the multiplicity of our identities in the Sudan. And these multiplicities, I think we are aware of the fact that these are sources of enrichment, not something to tear us apart. يعني دلوقتي, in my own part, and I'm glad that Abdul Wahab referred to Abiy and my family, going back to my great-grandfather, Arab, who established relations between the Dinka and the Arabs. You will not believe it. They bled their blood to become relatives, even though they did not change their religions. They remain Arabs and Dinka speaking, Arabic speaking, Muslim, non-Muslims, but they became Ahl, to the point that to this day, they contribute to marriages of our family. They share from the marriages of cattle. We still honor that relationship that was created by. Today, what do? We want to think of we are this or that. We are Northerners, Southerners. We are Africans, Arabs. We are negating the value of what we have inherited. Today, in my part of the country, in my family, we always slaughter everything killed عشان يبقى halal, to observe the halal rituals. And my father used to say it is not because he wants to endear himself to the Muslims. It's because he wants Muslims to feel assured that food in our house was halal, so that they don't become afraid, what am I eating and all that and that. So this cross-fertilization is a positive process. Yani, you cannot say that I'm any longer a typical Dinka. No, I've absorbed elements from the West, from the Arab world, from all of that. And that makes me the person I am. And I think I'm quite happy with the person I am because of social enrichment. النقطة يعني السؤال الأخير. Yes, I'm a strong believer in the fact, first of all, optimism, as I said before, instead of being pessimistic. But I have two last books after independence. One book called Sudan at the Brink, which was just before people voted for independence. And I then had a second book after the independence, called Bound by Conflict, which I said before, even though we are separated, we are still bonded, we are still bound by conflicts, by helping each other's rebels. I am now working towards turning being bound by conflict into being bonded by solutions. And I said, let the South and the North, let Sudan, South Sudan, cooperate to solve their internal problems and create a framework where we can come back together. وقلت في جملة in one of the books, the book Bound by Conflict, a sentence that is quoted by Mbeki quite a bit. I said, separation and unity are degrees of ongoing relations. South Sudan and Sudan are continuing to relate. Sudanese and South Sudanese are continuing to relate. Relationships can be strengthened or weakened, depending on the will of the people and their leadership. And therefore, if we can put the right framework there is today, I think we are closer today than we were during the war, because we are beginning to open up to seeing positives on both sides instead of rejecting. The identity of resistance was a negative identity. Now we have an identity of shared commonalities between South Sudanese and South Sudanese. So yes, I'm an optimist, and I believe that by solving our problems, we can get back to closer relationships than we had when we were united. Thanks.
Okay, do you have any more questions from I just wanted to, Francis, also to elaborate on the post-independence issues of identity in the post-independent South, where there were also conflicts that were not the original conflicts, although they had roots in this. What do you did you have any rethinking about issues of identity due to what happened in the South post-independence?
That's a very important question. As I said earlier, South Sudanese used to have a negative sense of identity. We are not Arabs, we are not Muslims, we are not this, we are none this, we are none that. And they thought that the problem of identity was simply emanating from our relations with the Northerners. Now that South Sudan is independent, they are finding that almost the same questions that tore us apart are being raised in South Sudan. There are groups in South Sudan who feel that the country is being dominated by two ethnic groups, Nuer and Dinka, and particularly by Dinka. And I tell some South Sudanese, I am beginning to feel more sympathetic to the Arabs of the Sudan than I used to be, because we are now the Arabs of South Sudan. And the question is, what therefore is identity crisis all about? It's a question of people feeling a sense of injustice, people feeling they're being dominated, people feeling their identities are not recognized, they're not accommodated as identity groups in the sharing. And I said earlier, we have to recognize that identity is relative. Somebody made a good point about the fact that identity can be broken up into tribes, into clans, into families, even within a family. And you can look at identity as a negative divisive factor. Or you can develop an identity of inclusivity, identity of equality, identity of belonging for everybody, whatever your color, whatever your religion, let's feel we belong. Some of us as individuals have had the opportunity of belonging. I never felt that I was being discriminated when I was in the government of Nimeri. I don't feel discriminated as ambassador of Sudan, no, I'm included. But you don't want it just to be an individual. You mentioned earlier about Colin Powell coming from Jamaica and becoming a very prominent figure. There was a time people thought he could actually run and win elections in presidency. And I said, would he be seen as a symbol of the unity of the United States, or would be seen as an exception? And obviously an exception. In many ways, you could say that individuals can rise to all levels, but the point is for the nation as a whole to feel that we are unified in our self-perception. So I would say that South Sudan is going through the same process. And the question then becomes again, we used to think we are all South Sudanese, we are all Africans, we are all not Muslims, not Arabs. Who are you? And I'm challenging South Sudanese now to each look at itself. The point was made earlier about my studies of the Dinka. Some people think this is being chauvinistic, being tribalistic. No, we need to know. I wrote a book about my father, the man called Deng, which was very nicely referred to, kindly. And somebody said, Yahi, if you are a unionist, why are you writing about your father? Why don't you write about Azhari or some of the big names in Sudan? That itself is a problem, because he doesn't think that talking about leaders of South Sudan is a contribution to national unity. I would be a unionist if I write about a prominent Arab. When I was in Khortagan Secondary School, all our classes were named after prominent Arab authors, Arab literary people, scholars, and all that. Shufta? Al-Dakhliyat, all the dormitories were named after northern chiefs. Not a single Dakhliya was named after a southern chief. Not a single class was named after an African leader. So these are symbols, but they're very important symbols. And I think more and more we are learning that our vision of the problem in the past was too simplistic, and that the problems that we were fighting in the North are here in the South. So perhaps we can learn the lessons of what happened in the Sudan and try to apply them in what happens in South Sudan, to create a South Sudan where people generally feel they are South Sudanese and not Dinka, not Nuer, not Shulu. And that is a function of how you share power and how you share resources, not just sharing as individuals, not just sharing as political parties, but sharing as citizens who believe they belong on equal footing, whatever their tribal identity.
Thank you. I think we had an interesting, as usual, presentations from our dear friend, Dr. Francis, who I always commend him as a person who wants to look at shared issues and shared values. And the fact that he is still hopeful of unity, I think, is indicative. If you want, before we end, to say a little bit about ABA and what is possible contribution to the link, to continue the links between North and South, and the fact that you are one of us, you are a northern. You are our.
Don't let's hear that.
You are our ambassador in the South.
Well, thank you. Let me just say a word about this. I'll just put it in a very generalized fashion. Whenever you have a crisis, people look to the negative side of relations, not the positive side. So let me tell you a little experience I had. I interviewed the Ngok Dinka at a time when they had just fought, and many people were killed on both sides. And it was an interview about worldview of the Dinka, from creation to contact with the outside world, to the world we are in now, and a vision to the future. Everything was negative about the Arabs. We were created different, we were different in color, different in customs, ways. There is nothing that can bring us together to become one people. Then we had a peace conference and we resolved the differences. Then I had another interview. These same people were saying, God created us as one. We were twins. We were the Arabs. We have intermarried. We are one people. The future is future of coming together. We will come together. So you see, when you have a crisis, all you see is the negative, not the positive. That's where the Ngok Dinka are today. There's a history of the Ngok Dinka playing a very positive role, starting my great-grandfather, whom I said blended his blood with his Arab counterpart to be relatives and created peace among their people. Now people don't want to look to that history. They just want to see how divided the country has become, all the negatives done to them. The same with the Arabs there. And I say, yes, let as a thread and needle that binds Sudan, South and North together into بالعربي يقول أن الإبرة الخيط, which ties the two into toe. Sew the toe to become one and all that. That vision I believe in, and I think that there was what you might call the wisdom of our elders that we are not heeding. Incidentally, you do not only talk like a Muslim from the South, you talk like a Muslim from Iran. So here I am, not a Muslim, not technically speaking from the South because I'm IBA, and yet I'm being seen as talking as though I'm a Muslim from Iran, which means that I have assimilated something. And yet the person saying this is a typical Northern Sudanese Muslim leader. So we are, in many ways, a mix that tends to see the negative. And what is challenging is for us to open our eyes to the positive. Sudan is a country enriched by our diversities. These diversities have torn us apart, but we can still turn them into a positive. And I still see a Sudan, South Sudan linkage that can still, I used to say when I was representing Sudan, do we want to be just Africans? Do we want to be just Arabs? Or do we benefit from being a link between Africa and the Arab world? That is what Sudan was. That's what I hope Sudan, together with South Sudan, still can be. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francis, and thanks for all our audiences with us here or on Zoom or on the other Facebook, Instagram, all of our media, of course, Twitter as well. Shukran, Aziz Francis, and seeing you again, and we hope.
Thank you very much, Abdul Wahab, and thank you all for listening. And I hope our conversation continues even if we don't see one another.
Thank you. Shukran. Thank you.
Shukran.